Jake Morrison pulled his worn coat tighter as another gust of wind cut through the canyon like a blade. The snow had been falling for 3 days straight, and what started as light flurries had turned into a blizzard that made traveling nearly impossible. His horse, a sturdy bay named Thunder, snorted and shook his head, ice crystals forming around his nostrils. The cowboy had been riding fence for the Broken Arrow Ranch when the storm hit. Now he was trapped in unfamiliar territory, miles from the main ranch house, with night falling fast and the temperature dropping dangerously low. Jake had spent enough winters in Montana territory to know that this kind of weather could kill a man if he didn't find shelter soon. Through the swirling snow, he spotted what looked like an overhang of rock about 50 yards ahead. It wasn't much, but it might provide enough protection to keep them both alive until morning. Jake urged Thunder forward, the horse's hooves crunching through snow that was already knee-deep in places. As they approached the rocky shelter, Jake noticed something that made him pull up short. Smoke. A thin wisp of gray smoke was rising from behind the rock formation, barely visible against the darkening sky. Someone else had found this shelter first. Jake's hand instinctively moved to the Colt revolver at his hip. Out here in the wilderness, you never knew who you might encounter. Could be another cowboy caught in the storm, or it might be someone less friendly. Cattle rustlers and bandits were known to use remote spots like this as hideouts. He dismounted and led Thunder closer, moving as quietly as possible through the snow. The wind was howling so loudly that it would mask most sounds, but Jake had learned to be careful during his years working the range. As he rounded the edge of the rock formation, he could see the glow of a small fire reflected off the stone walls of what appeared to be a shallow cave. What Jake saw next made him freeze in his tracks. A young Native American woman sat huddled near the fire, her dark hair hanging loose around her shoulders. She wore a buckskin dress and moccasins, but Jake could see that she was shivering despite the flames. Her lips had a blue tinge that spoke of dangerous cold, and her hands were wrapped around her arms in an attempt to conserve warmth. She looked up at the sound of Thunder's movement, and Jake found himself staring into the most striking pair of dark eyes he had ever seen. For a moment, neither of them moved. The woman's expression showed surprise but not fear, which struck Jake as unusual. Most folks, regardless of their background, would be alarmed to suddenly find a stranger approaching their shelter in the middle of a blizzard. The woman spoke first, her voice barely audible over the wind. "Your horse needs shelter, too." Jake blinked, surprised by her calm tone and the fact that she spoke English clearly. He had expected hostility, or at least wariness. Instead, she seemed more concerned about Thunder than about the armed stranger who had just appeared at her camp. "Yes, ma'am," Jake replied, touching the brim of his hat out of habit. "I was hoping to find shelter from this storm. I didn't know anyone was already here." The woman studied him for a long moment, taking in his ice-covered coat, his frost-covered mustache, and the way he was favoring his left leg where the cold had made an old injury ache. "You are hurt?" "Just cold and tired," Jake said. "Been riding for hours trying to get ahead of this weather." She nodded toward the back of the cave. "There is room for the horse. The wind does not reach far inside." Jake hesitated. Everything he had been taught about Indians suggested he should be wary, but the woman showed no signs of aggression. More importantly, Thunder was starting to show serious signs of distress from the cold, and Jake knew that without shelter, they might both die before morning. "Much obliged," he said, leading Thunder into the cave. The shelter was larger than it had appeared from outside. The cave extended back about 20 feet and was wide enough for both the horse and several people. Someone had arranged stones to create a fire ring, and there was evidence that this spot had been used as a shelter many times before. A pile of dried wood sat against one wall, probably gathered during warmer weather. As Jake unsaddled Thunder and rubbed the horse down with an old blanket, he became aware that the woman was watching him with curious eyes. She had added more wood to the fire, and the cave was starting to warm up noticeably. "You know this place well," Jake observed, nodding toward the organized setup. "My people have used this shelter for many seasons," she replied. "It is a safe place to wait out storms." Jake finished tending to Thunder and turned to face the woman. Up close, he could see that she was probably in her early 20s, with intelligent eyes and strong features. Despite the cold, she carried herself with a dignity that impressed him. "I'm Jake Morrison," he said. "I work for the Broken Arrow Ranch." "I am Ayanna," she replied. "I was traveling to visit relatives when the storm caught me." "Ayanna," Jake repeated, trying to pronounce it correctly. "That's a pretty name." A small smile crossed her lips. "It means eternal blossom in my language." They sat in awkward silence for a few minutes, both staring at the fire. Jake pulled some jerky and hardtack from his saddlebags, and after a moment's hesitation, offered some to Ayanna. She accepted it with a nod of thanks. "How long you think this storm will last?" Jake asked. Ayanna looked toward the cave entrance where snow was still blowing in despite the shelter. 2 days, maybe 3. This is a strong storm. The kind that changes the shape of the land?" Jake's heart sank. He had food for maybe 1 day, and while Thunder could survive on the dried grass he carried, it wouldn't last long. More concerning was the cold. Even with the fire, the cave was barely warm enough to prevent frostbite. As if reading his thoughts, Ayanna spoke up. "We will need to share warmth if we want to survive." Jake felt heat rise in his face, and he was grateful for the dim light that hid his embarrassment. "Ma'am, I wouldn't want to—" "It is not about want," Ayanna said matter-of-factly. "It is about staying alive. I have seen men freeze to death because they were too proud to accept help." She was right, of course. Jake had heard enough stories about people dying in blizzards to know that survival sometimes required setting aside social conventions. Still, the situation felt uncomfortable. He barely knew this woman, and everything he had been raised to believe suggested that being alone with her in such circumstances was improper. "I understand your concern," Ayanna continued, as if sensing his thoughts. "But death does not care about propriety." The temperature continued to drop as night fell, and soon both Jake and Ayanna were shivering despite the fire. The wind outside had intensified, and snow was blowing into the cave despite their best efforts to block the entrance with rocks and Jake's saddle. Ayanna moved closer to the fire, but Jake could see that she was still cold. Her hands were shaking, and her lips had taken on an alarming blue color again. He realized that her buckskin dress, while well-made, was not designed for this kind of extreme weather. "Miss Ayanna," Jake said finally, "maybe we should consider your suggestion about sharing warmth." She looked at him with those penetrating dark eyes. "You have decided that survival is more important than shame?" "I reckon survival is more important than a lot of things," Jake replied. Ayanna nodded and moved to arrange their bedrolls near the fire. Jake's was a thick wool blanket that had seen better days, while hers appeared to be made of buffalo hide lined with rabbit fur. Together, they would provide better insulation than either could alone. As they prepared for the night, Jake found himself stealing glances at his unexpected companion. She moved with a quiet efficiency that spoke of years of wilderness experience. Everything she did seemed purposeful and well-considered, from the way she banked the fire to the manner in which she arranged the bedding. "You've done this before," Jake observed. "Survived storms like this, I mean." "Many times," Ayanna replied. "My father taught me that nature is both friend and enemy. She provides what we need to live, but she also tests us to see if we are worthy of her gifts." "Sounds like a wise man, your father." A shadow crossed Ayanna's face. "He was. He died last winter during a hunting accident." "I'm sorry for your loss," Jake said softly. "Thank you." He lived a full life and died doing something he loved. There are worse ways to leave this world. They settled down for the night, lying side by side under the combined blankets with a careful space between them. The warmth was immediate and welcome, and Jake felt his muscles begin to relax for the first time in hours. The storm raged on outside, but inside the cave they had created a small island of warmth and safety. Jake listened to the steady sound of Ayanna's breathing and found it surprisingly comforting. He had spent many nights alone on the range, but somehow this felt different. Despite the circumstances that had brought them together, there was something peaceful about sharing the space with someone who seemed so comfortable with the wilderness. "Jake?" Ayanna's voice was soft in the darkness. "Yes, ma'am?" "Why do you work alone on the range? Most cowboys travel in groups." Jake considered the question. "I guess I've always been more comfortable with my own company. People can be complicated." "And you think nature is simpler?" "Nature's honest," Jake replied. "A storm doesn't pretend to be something it's not. A wild animal doesn't lie about its intentions. With people, you never know what they're really thinking." Ayanna was quiet for a moment. "Perhaps you have not met the right people." "Perhaps not," Jake admitted. They fell silent again, but Jake found his mind racing despite his exhaustion. Here he was, sharing a shelter with a Native American woman he had met just hours ago, and instead of the danger or discomfort he might have expected, he felt oddly at peace. Ayanna had shown him nothing but kindness and practical wisdom since their first meeting. As the night wore on, the temperature continued to drop. Despite their shared warmth, Jake could feel the cold seeping through their makeshift shelter. At some point during the early morning hours, he became aware that Ayanna had moved closer to him in her sleep, seeking warmth. Her head was now resting against his shoulder, and he could feel her breath against his neck. Jake lay very still, not wanting to wake her but acutely aware of her presence. He had never been this close to any woman, let alone one from a culture so different from his own. Yet somehow, it felt natural rather than strange. Ayanna radiated a warmth that seemed to go beyond the physical, and Jake found himself wondering about her life, her people, her dreams. When dawn finally came, filtering weakly through the blowing snow at the cave entrance, Jake realized that the storm was still raging with undiminished fury. If anything, it seemed to have intensified overnight. The entrance to the cave was partially blocked by drifted snow, and the wind outside sounded like a freight train. Ayanna stirred and opened her eyes, seeming momentarily confused by their close proximity. Then awareness returned, and she moved away with quiet dignity. "Good morning," she said simply. "Morning," Jake replied. "Looks like you were right about this storm lasting a while." Ayanna moved to the cave entrance and studied the weather conditions. "This will continue for at least another day, maybe two. We should prepare to be here longer than planned." Jake took inventory of their supplies. Between them, they had enough food for perhaps 2 more days if they were careful. Water wouldn't be a problem with all the snow outside, but fuel for the fire was a more serious concern. The pile of wood in the cave would last another day at most. "We're going to need more wood," Jake said. "There are fallen branches in the trees beyond the rocks," Ayanna replied, "but gathering them in this storm would be dangerous. Might have to risk it if we want to stay warm." Ayanna studied him thoughtfully. "You would go out in that storm?" "If it means we don't freeze to death, yes. Then we go together. 2 people are less likely to become lost than 1. Jake wanted to protest, to say that he couldn't put her in danger, but he could see from her expression that arguing would be pointless. Besides, she knew this area better than he did, and her knowledge could make the difference between success and disaster. They spent the morning planning their wood-gathering expedition and tending to Thunder, who seemed to be handling the cold better than either of his human companions. Ayana shared some of her knowledge of survival techniques, showing Jake how to layer clothing for maximum warmth and how to recognize the early signs of frostbite. In return, Jake shared stories of his life on the range, describing the vast cattle drives and the challenges of working with livestock in difficult conditions. Ayana listened with genuine interest, asking thoughtful questions that showed she understood the complexities of ranch work. As they talked, Jake found himself increasingly impressed by her intelligence and practical knowledge. She spoke 3 languages fluently, knew the medicinal properties of dozens of plants, and could read weather patterns with an accuracy that rivaled any rancher he had ever known. "Where did you learn to speak English so well?" Jake asked. "My mother was educated at a mission school before she married my father," Ayana explained. "She believed that understanding different cultures would help our people survive in a changing world. She taught me that knowledge is like water. It can flow in many directions and adapt to any container." "Sounds like both your parents were wise people." "They were. They taught me to judge people by their actions, not by their appearance or reputation." Jake felt the weight of those words. He realized that he had approached this encounter with his own set of assumptions and prejudices, many of which had already proven to be wrong. Ayana had shown him nothing but cooperation and kindness, despite having every reason to be suspicious of a strange white man appearing at her shelter. By midday, it became clear that they would need to venture out for wood soon. The fire was burning low, and the temperature in the cave was dropping noticeably. Jake and Ayana prepared carefully, wrapping themselves in extra clothing and planning their route to minimize time in the open. Just before they left the cave, Ayana turned to Jake with a serious expression. "Whatever happens out there, we stay together, promise me." "I promise," Jake replied, and he meant it. They stepped out into the storm together, immediately hit by wind so fierce it nearly knocked them off their feet. The world had become a white void where visibility was measured in feet rather than yards. Jake reached for Ayana's hand and she gripped his tightly as they fought their way through the blowing snow toward the tree line. The cold was beyond anything Jake had ever experienced. Within minutes, his face was numb and his eyes were streaming tears that froze almost instantly. But Ayana pressed forward with determination, leading him toward an area where the wind had brought down several large branches. Working together, they managed to gather enough wood to last through the night, breaking the branches into manageable pieces and tying them together with rope from Jake's saddle. The work was exhausting in the deep snow and fierce wind, but they managed to complete it in less than an hour. The journey back to the cave was the most terrifying experience of Jake's life. The storm had intensified even further, and at times he could barely make out Ayana's form despite holding her hand. More than once, they had to stop and wait for a lull in the wind to get their bearings. When they finally stumbled back into the cave, both were close to exhaustion and hypothermic. Jake's hands were so cold he could barely feel them, and Ayana's lips had turned blue again despite their brief time outside. They quickly rebuilt the fire and huddled together for warmth, both shivering uncontrollably. For several minutes, neither could speak, as they waited for feeling to return to their extremities. "That was closer than I'd like," Jake finally managed to say through chattering teeth. "But we survived," Ayana replied, "and now we have enough wood to last until the storm passes." As warmth gradually returned to their bodies, Jake found himself looking at Ayana with new respect. She had shown courage and determination that matched any cowboy he had ever ridden with, and her knowledge of survival had probably saved both their lives. The rest of the day passed quietly as they conserved energy and waited for the storm to exhaust itself. They talked occasionally, sharing stories and observations, but mostly they simply existed together in the warm circle of firelight. As evening approached, Jake realized that despite the dangerous circumstances, he was reluctant for their time together to end. Tomorrow, if the weather cleared, they would go their separate ways. He back to the Broken Arrow Ranch, and she to her relatives. The thought left him with an unexpected sense of loss. "Ayanna," he said as they prepared for another night of shared warmth, "I want you to know that meeting you has changed how I think about things." She looked at him with those penetrating dark eyes. "How so?" "I had ideas about your people that weren't fair or accurate. You've shown me kindness when you had no reason to, and wisdom that puts most folks I know to shame. I'm grateful for that." Ayanna smiled, and Jake thought it was the most beautiful sight he had ever seen. Perhaps this storm brought us together for a reason. Jake Morrison. As they settled down for the night, Jake found himself hoping that she was right. The howling wind outside seemed less threatening now, and the uncertain future less frightening. Whatever tomorrow might bring, he knew that this experience had changed him in ways he was only beginning to understand. Dawn broke gray and silent. Jake woke to find the cave unusually quiet, and when he peered toward the entrance, he saw that the storm had finally passed. The constant howling of wind had been replaced by an eerie stillness that seemed to echo off the rock walls. Ayanna was already awake, sitting near the fire and looking toward the cave opening. "It is finished," she said softly. "The storm has moved on." Jake sat up and listened to the silence. After 3 days of constant wind and snow, the quiet felt almost unnatural. "Reckon we'll be able to travel today?" "Perhaps. But the snow will be very deep in places. It will be dangerous for your horse." Jake rose and walked to the cave entrance. What he saw took his breath away. The world outside had been completely transformed. Snow drifts reached almost to the top of nearby boulders, and the familiar landscape had been reshaped into something alien and beautiful. The sun was breaking through scattered clouds, making the snow sparkle like diamonds. "Lord Almighty," Jake breathed. "I've never seen anything like this." Ayanna joined him at the entrance. "This is what my grandmother called a spirit storm. She said they come to change things that have remained the same too long." Jake glanced at her, struck by the thoughtful way she spoke. During their time together, he had noticed that Ayanna often expressed herself in ways that seemed to carry deeper meaning. It made him think more carefully about his own words and assumptions. They broke their fast with the last of Jake's jerky and some pine needle tea that Ayanna prepared from branches near the cave. The tea was bitter but warming, and she explained that it would help prevent the sickness that sometimes came after being cold for many days. "My people have used this medicine for countless generations," she said as they sipped the hot liquid. "The forest provides what we need, if we know how to listen." "Listening to trees seems like a useful skill out here," Jake replied. "I usually just listen to cattle and horses." Ayanna smiled. "Animals have much to teach us as well. My father always said that a man who could understand horses would never want for friends." "Your father sounds like he understood cow work pretty well for—" Jake stopped himself, realizing he was about to make another assumption based on race. "For an Indian?" Ayanna finished gently. "My father spent 2 seasons working cattle drives when he was young. He said it taught him much about white men and about how different peoples could work toward common goals." Jake felt heat rise in his face. "I keep putting my foot in my mouth around you. I apologize." "There is no need. We all carry the stories our people tell us about others. The question is whether we let those stories blind us to what we see with our own eyes." After breakfast, they worked together to prepare for departure. Jake saddled Thunder, while Ayanna packed her few belongings and scattered the ashes of their fire. She moved with the same quiet efficiency that had impressed Jake throughout their time together, leaving the cave as clean as they had found it. When they emerged fully into the post-storm world, both Jake and Thunder struggled with the deep snow. What had been a relatively easy ride 3 days ago was now a treacherous journey through drifts that sometimes reached Thunder's belly. Ayanna, however, seemed to glide across the snow surface with practiced ease. Her moccasins were designed for winter travel, and she knew how to distribute her weight to avoid breaking through the crust. More importantly, she could read the landscape and guide them around the deepest drifts. "Stay behind me," she instructed. "I will break trail for your horse." For the next hour, Ayanna led them through the transformed landscape, choosing a path that kept Thunder from becoming mired in deep snow. Jake found himself studying her movements, amazed by her sure-footed progress through terrain that would have challenged an experienced mountain man. As they traveled, Jake began to recognize landmarks from his original journey. The familiar ridge that marked the boundary of Broken Arrow ranch land was visible ahead, though it looked different under its blanket of snow. "I know where we are now," Jake said. "The ranch headquarters is about 5 miles that direction." He pointed toward the southeast. Ayanna nodded but didn't change course. Instead, she led them toward a grove of cottonwoods that Jake remembered passing on his way to check fence line. "Water," she explained when he questioned the detour. "Both you and your horse will need to drink before traveling further." She was right, as usual. Jake realized that in his eagerness to get back to familiar territory, he was ignoring basic needs. They found a stream that was still running despite the cold, and both Jake and Thunder drank deeply of the clear, cold water. As Thunder rested, Jake found himself watching Ayanna gather something from beneath the snow near the creek bank. She worked with quick, sure movements, digging through the snow to reach roots or plants that most people would never have known were there. "Medicine plants," she explained when she noticed his attention. "The cold makes some of them more powerful. My aunt will need these for the winter sickness that comes to our village." "The relatives you were traveling to see?" "Yes. My mother's sister and her family. They live in the canyon beyond the Red Rocks, about 2 days' ride from here." Jake calculated distances in his head. The Red Rocks, she mentioned, were in the opposite direction from the Broken Arrow Ranch. If they parted ways here, as logic suggested they should, it might be the last time he ever saw her. The thought bothered him more than he wanted to admit. "Ayanna," he said carefully, "would your relatives mind if I rode with you part of the way? I'd like to make sure you get there safely after everything that's happened." She studied his face with those penetrating dark eyes, and Jake had the uncomfortable feeling that she could read his thoughts. "You are concerned for my safety, or you are not ready to say goodbye?" The directness of her question caught Jake off guard. He had become accustomed to her honest way of speaking, but this felt like she was looking straight into his soul. "Maybe both," he admitted. Ayanna was quiet for a long moment, gathering the last of her plants. When she stood, her expression was serious. "Jake Morrison, I need to tell you something. My people and your people have not always been friends. Some of your people see us as threats to be eliminated. Some of my people see yours as invaders who take without asking. If you ride with me to my aunt's village, you may not be welcomed." "I understand that," Jake replied. "But I reckon people deserve to be judged as individuals, not as members of a group. If your relatives are anything like you, I think we'll get along fine. And if they are not like me?" Jake considered the question seriously. "Then I guess I'll deal with that when it happens. But I'd still like to see you safely to your destination." Ayanna studied him for another long moment, then nodded. "Very well. But we travel as equals, not as protector and protected. I can take care of myself, as I have proven." "Agreed," Jake said quickly. "I've seen enough to know you're probably better at taking care of yourself than I am." They set out together through the snow-covered landscape, with Ayanna continuing to break trail and navigate around obstacles. As they traveled, she shared more of her knowledge about reading the land and understanding the subtle signs that indicated safe travel routes. "The snow tells stories," she explained, pointing to different patterns in the drifts. "This swirl means there was a strong wind from the west. These ridges show where animals have been traveling. The smooth areas often hide rocks or holes that can trap a horse." Jake listened carefully, realizing that he was learning skills that could save his life in future wilderness situations. Cowboys were used to reading cattle and weather, but Ayanna was teaching him to read the land itself in ways he had never considered. As the day progressed, they settled into an easy traveling rhythm. Jake found conversation with Ayanna to be unlike any he had ever experienced. She listened carefully to everything he said and responded with thoughtful observations that often made him see familiar things in new ways. When Jake mentioned his concerns about the changing cattle industry and the challenges facing small ranchers, Ayanna drew parallels to her own people's struggles to adapt to a changing world. "My father used to say that the strongest tree is not the one that never bends, but the one that bends with the wind without breaking," she said. "Perhaps your cattle people and my people face similar challenges in different forms. Meaning we both have to figure out how to change without losing what makes us who we are?" "Exactly." They paused for a midday rest near a sheltered spot where the snow wasn't as deep. Jake shared some hardtack from his saddlebags, and Ayanna produced jerky made from elk meat that was far more flavorful than anything Jake had ever tasted. "This is excellent," Jake said, savoring the rich, smoky flavor. "Your people sure know how to preserve meat." "My grandmother's recipe. She taught me that the secret is in the herbs and the smoking process. Each family has their own method, passed down through generations." "Like brand marks for cattle families," Jake observed. Ayanna laughed, a sound that Jake realized he had come to treasure over their short time together. "I never thought of it that way, but yes. Each family's jerky is as distinctive as your cattle brands." As they rested, Jake found himself studying Ayanna's profile as she gazed across the snow-covered landscape. There was something about her that drew his attention, not just her physical beauty, but the way she carried herself with quiet confidence and spoke with such thoughtful wisdom. "Can I ask you something personal?" Jake said. "You may ask. I will decide whether to answer. How come you're not married? I mean, a woman like you. I figure men would be lining up." Ayanna was quiet for so long that Jake began to think he had overstepped. Finally, she spoke. "I was promised to a warrior from a neighboring tribe when I was younger. But he was killed in a hunting accident before we could marry. Since then, I have not met a man who understood that a woman can be both strong and gentle, both independent and caring. Maybe you just haven't met the right man yet." "Perhaps," Ayanna said, turning to look at him directly. "And you, Jake Morrison? Why does a man who clearly has good qualities ride alone across the winter range?" Jake felt his face redden. "I guess I never found a woman who could put up with a cowboy's life. Most ladies want stability, a house in town, regular hours. Ranch work doesn't offer much of that. Most ladies, but not all?" "I suppose there might be exceptions," Jake said, meeting her gaze. They looked at each other for a moment that seemed to stretch longer than it should have, and Jake felt something shift between them. What had started as mutual respect and shared survival was becoming something deeper and more complicated. The afternoon brought new challenges as they descended into a valley where the snow was not only deep, but also soft and unstable. Thunder struggled with each step, and even Ayanna had difficulty maintaining sure footing. "We need to find a different route," she said, after Thunder nearly foundered in a hidden drift. "This valley will be impassable for another week at least." Ayanna led them up a steep ridge that Jake would never have attempted on his own. The path was narrow and treacherous, but it offered firmer footing and took them around the worst of the valley snow. As they climbed, Jake marveled at Ayanna's ability to find safe routes through seemingly impossible terrain. She moved with the confidence of someone who had been reading landscape all her life, pausing occasionally to test snow depth or examine the stability of the path ahead. "How do you know this way?" Jake asked during one particularly challenging section. "My father brought me here when I was 12 to teach me about emergency routes. He said that knowing one path was knowledge, but knowing many paths was wisdom." Your father sounds like he was quite a teacher. He was, but he also said that the best teacher is experience itself. No amount of instruction can replace learning by doing. When they finally crested the ridge, Jake was rewarded with a spectacular view of the country beyond. Rolling hills stretched to the horizon, their natural contours softened and emphasized by the heavy snow. In the distance, he could see the red rock formations that Ayanna had mentioned. "Beautiful country," Jake said. "Yes. My people have lived in this region for more generations than anyone can count. Every hill and valley has stories. Every rock formation has meaning. Must be nice to have that kind of connection to a place." Ayanna glanced at him. "You do not feel connected to your ranch lands?" Jake considered the question. "I suppose I do, but it's different. I know the land as a place to work, to run cattle, to make a living. You're talking about something deeper. The land is not just a place where we live. It is part of who we are. When we die, our bodies return to feed the earth that fed us. We are all connected. The people, the animals, the plants, the rocks, the water." "That's a nice way to think about things," Jake said. "Makes a man feel like he's part of something bigger." "You are part of something bigger, Jake Morrison. We all are. The question is whether we choose to recognize it." They descended the far side of the ridge as afternoon shadows began to lengthen. Jake realized that they would need to make camp soon, as traveling this terrain in darkness would be dangerous. "There is a sheltered place ahead where we can spend the night," Ayanna said, as if reading his thoughts. "It is not a cave, but it will provide protection from wind and any new snow." The campsite she led them to was a grove of large pine trees that created a natural windbreak. The thick canopy had prevented most of the snow from accumulating on the ground, leaving a relatively clear area large enough for their camp. As they set up for the night, Jake noticed that their routine had become smooth and coordinated. Ayanna gathered wood and prepared the fire ring while Jake tended to Thunder and arranged their sleeping area. They worked together with the efficiency of a team that had been cooperating for years rather than days. "We've gotten pretty good at this camping business," Jake observed as they settled by the fire with their evening meal. "Shared hardship creates understanding quickly," Ayanna replied. "Crisis has a way of showing people's true character." "What has it shown you about me?" Ayanna considered the question seriously. "It has shown me that you are brave without being reckless, considerate without being weak, and honest about your limitations. These are good qualities in any man, regardless of his background. And you've shown me that everything I thought I knew about Indian people was wrong," Jake replied. "You're one of the finest people I've ever met, regardless of background." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the fire and listening to the quiet sounds of the winter forest. Jake found himself reluctant to break the peaceful mood, but there were practical matters to discuss. "How far to your relative's village?" he asked. "Half a day's travel if the weather holds. We should reach them by early afternoon tomorrow." The finality in her voice reminded Jake that their time together was nearly over. Tomorrow afternoon, he would need to say goodbye and head back to the Broken Arrow Ranch alone. The thought filled him with unexpected sadness. "Ayanna," he said carefully, "I want you to know that these past few days have meant something to me, more than I can really put into words." She looked at him across the fire, her dark eyes reflecting the flames. "They have meant something to me as well, Jake Morrison." "What happens tomorrow, after I see you safely to your relatives?" "Tomorrow you will return to your life, and I will return to mine." "Is that what you want?" Ayanna was quiet for a long time, staring into the fire. When she finally spoke, her voice was soft. "What I want and what is possible are not always the same thing." "Why not?" "Because you are a white man who works on a cattle ranch, and I am an Indian woman whose people have been fighting for survival in a world that grows smaller every day. because our peoples have different ways of living, different beliefs, different expectations. Because a connection between us, no matter how strong, would face challenges that might destroy us both. Jake felt his heart sink, even though her words echoed thoughts that had been forming in his own mind. So we just pretend these days never happened? No. We remember them as something beautiful and precious. We carry them with us as proof that understanding between different peoples is possible. But we do not pretend that the world is different than it actually is. Jake stared into the fire, struggling with emotions he hadn't expected to feel. And if I don't want to just remember? If I want to find a way to make it work? Ayanna looked at him with infinite sadness in her eyes. Then you would need to be certain that what you feel is strong enough to withstand the disapproval of your people and the suspicion of mine. You would need to be prepared for a life that might satisfy neither world completely. Maybe some things are worth the risk, perhaps, but such decisions should not be made in the heat of the moment, surrounded by the intensity of shared danger. They should be made with careful thought, after time has passed and the mind has cleared. Jake knew she was right, but that didn't make her words any easier to accept. They had found something special together, something that might not come along again in either of their lifetimes. As they prepared for sleep, Jake found himself memorizing details about Ayanna. The way she moved with such quiet grace, the thoughtful way she considered every question before answering, the gentle strength in her voice when she spoke about things that mattered to her. When they lay down under their shared blankets for what might be the last time, Jake spoke into the darkness. Whatever happens tomorrow, I want you to know that meeting you has changed me for the better. And meeting you has reminded me that there are good people in all tribes, Ayanna replied softly. They lay side by side in the darkness, both aware that dawn would bring the end of their brief time together. Jake listened to Ayanna's quiet breathing and tried to imagine returning to his solitary life on the range. The prospect seemed emptier now than it ever had before. Sometime during the night, Jake woke to find that Ayanna had moved closer to him in sleep, her head once again resting against his shoulder. This time, however, he sensed that it was about more than just seeking warmth. There was something peaceful and right about their closeness that had nothing to do with survival necessity. As he lay awake watching the stars through the pine boughs above, Jake made a decision. Whatever the challenges might be, he wasn't ready to simply say goodbye and walk away. Some opportunities in life were too precious to abandon without a fight, and the connection he felt with Ayanna was certainly one of them. He would see her safely to her relative's village as promised, but that wouldn't be the end of the story. He would find a way to prove to her, and to himself, that what they had discovered together was worth whatever obstacles they might face. The future was uncertain, but Jake Morrison had never been one to back down from a challenge, and if Ayanna was willing to consider the possibility, he was prepared to fight for a chance at a future together, regardless of what the rest of the world might think. The morning brought clear skies and crisp air that made every breath visible. Jake woke to find Ayanna already up, standing at the edge of their camp and looking toward the red rocks in the distance. Her posture was tense, and Jake sensed that she was struggling with the same emotions that had kept him awake much of the night. "Second thoughts about something?" Jake asked as he joined her. "Many thoughts," Ayanna replied without looking at him. "About what lies ahead, about what we leave behind." Jake studied her profile, noting the way morning light played across her features. "We don't have to leave anything behind if we don't choose to. Do we not?" Ayanna turned to face him, and Jake could see conflict in her dark eyes. "You speak as if choice is simple, as if wanting something makes it possible. Sometimes it does, and sometimes it brings only pain to everyone involved." They broke camp in relative silence, both lost in their own thoughts, As they prepared to leave, Jake noticed that Ayanna moved with less of her usual fluid grace. She seemed distracted, almost reluctant to continue their journey. The final stretch to her relative's village took them through increasingly familiar territory. Ayanna pointed out landmarks from her childhood, a distinctive rock formation where she had learned to climb, a meadow where her family had gathered medicinal plants, a creek where she had caught her first fish. "You have good memories of this place," Jake observed. "Yes, but also some difficult ones. This is where I said goodbye to my father for the last time, before his final hunting trip." "I'm sorry. That must make being here bittersweet." "Life is often bittersweet," Ayanna said. "Joy and sorrow walk side by side, like old friends who have learned to tolerate each other." As they crested a final rise, Jake saw smoke rising from cooking fires in the distance. The village was small, perhaps 20 teepees arranged in a rough circle with a larger structure at the center. People moved about their daily tasks, and Jake could see children playing in the snow near the edge of the settlement. "There," Ayanna said, pointing toward the village. "My mother's sister lives in the teepee with the blue markings near the center." Jake felt his stomach tighten with nervousness. Everything up to this point had been just between him and Ayanna, but now they would face the judgment of her family and community. He was acutely aware that he might not be welcome, regardless of his intentions. As if sensing his thoughts, Ayanna spoke without looking at him. "Whatever happens in the next few hours, remember that you have earned my respect and friendship. That will not change based on how others react to your presence." "I appreciate that," Jake said. "But I'd like to earn their respect too, if possible." "Then listen more than you speak, observe more than you judge, and remember that every culture has wisdom worth learning." As they approached the village, Jake noticed that people had begun to stop their activities and watch their approach. He could see curiosity in their faces and perhaps some wariness, but no immediate hostility. Several children ran ahead to announce their arrival. A middle-aged woman emerged from the teepee with blue markings, and Jake knew immediately that this was Ayanna's aunt. She had the same strong features and intelligent eyes, though her hair was streaked with gray and her face showed the lines of someone who had experienced both joy and sorrow. "Ayanna!" the woman called, opening her arms as Ayanna dismounted and ran to embrace her. They spoke rapidly in their own language, and Jake caught his name mentioned several times. The aunt's eyes kept moving to him as they talked, studying him with obvious curiosity. Finally, Ayanna turned to Jake and beckoned him forward. "Uncle, this is Jake Morrison, the man I told you about. Jake, this is my aunt, Winona." Winona approached Jake with dignity and spoke to him in accented but clear English. "My niece tells me that you shared shelter during the great storm and that you showed her respect and kindness. For this, you are welcome in our village." "Thank you, ma'am," Jake replied, removing his hat. "Your niece saved my life as much as I might have saved hers. I'm grateful for her wisdom and her company." Winona studied Jake's face carefully, then nodded approvingly. "You speak with respect? This is good. Come, you must be hungry after your journey." As they moved toward Winona's teepee, Jake became aware that the entire village was watching them with intense interest. He felt like an exotic animal in a traveling show, but he tried to maintain his composure and follow Ayanna's advice about observing more than judging. The interior of the teepee was surprisingly spacious and comfortable. Decorated buffalo robes covered the floor, and the walls were adorned with intricate beadwork and painted designs. A small fire burned in the center, providing warmth and light. Winona bustled about preparing food while other family members filed in to meet the visitors. Jake was introduced to Ayanna's uncle, a man named Takoda, who had been a respected warrior before an injury ended his fighting days. Two teenage cousins watched Jake with barely concealed fascination, as if they had never expected to see a white man sitting peacefully in their home. The meal that followed was both delicious and educational. Jake sampled foods he had never tasted before, listened to conversations in a language he couldn't understand, and observed family dynamics that seemed both foreign and familiar. Despite the cultural differences, he recognized the universal patterns of family love, gentle teasing, and shared concern for each other's welfare. Throughout the meal, Jake noticed that Ayanna seemed different among her relatives. She was more animated, laughing more frequently, and speaking with obvious comfort and affection. Seeing her in this context made Jake realize how much she had been holding back during their time together, how carefully she had been presenting herself to a stranger from another culture. After the meal, Dakota approached Jake with obvious purpose. "You wish to speak with me outside?" he asked in careful English. Jake glanced at Ayanna, who nodded encouragingly. "Yes, sir." "I'd appreciate that." They walked to a quiet area at the edge of the village where they could speak privately. Dakota was a large man despite his injury, and Jake could see that he had once been a formidable warrior. His manner was serious, but not unfriendly. "My niece tells me unusual things about you," Dakota began. "She says you treated her as an equal, not as a burden or a threat. She says you listened to her knowledge and respected her judgment. Is this true?" "Yes, sir. Your niece is one of the wisest people I've ever met. She probably saved my life several times during that storm." Dakota nodded approvingly. "Ayanna has always been special among our young women. She has the wisdom of an elder and the courage of a warrior. But she has also been alone too long since her father died. She mentioned that she lost him recently. Last winter. He was my brother and a good man. Before he died, he made me promise to look after Ayanna, to help her find a path that would bring her happiness." Jake sensed that this conversation was heading in a direction he hadn't expected. "Sir, I hope you don't think I'm trying to take advantage of your niece. I have nothing but respect for her." "I can see that," Dakota said, "but respect is not the only thing I see when you look at her." Jake felt heat rise in his face. "No, sir, it's not. What are your intentions toward my niece?" The direct question caught Jake off guard. He had expected suspicion or hostility, not this frank inquiry about his romantic intentions. "Sir, I care about Ayanna more than I can properly express, but I also understand that my feelings don't necessarily mean anything can come of them. We're from different worlds." "Different, yes, but perhaps not as different as you think." Dakota studied Jake's face carefully. "Tell me, what do you see when you look at our village?" Jake considered the question seriously, thinking about his observations during the afternoon. "I see families caring for each other, children learning from their elders, people working together to provide what everyone needs. I see folks dealing with the same challenges that face everyone trying to make a living in tough country." "And what do you think we see when we look at you?" "Probably a white man who might be a threat to your way of life." Dakota smiled for the first time since they had begun talking. "Some would see that, yes, but I see a man who treated my niece with respect when he could have taken advantage of her vulnerability. I see someone who listened to her wisdom instead of dismissing it. I see a person who has learned something about our ways without trying to change them." Jake wasn't sure how to respond to this unexpected approval. "Thank you, sir. That means more than you know. The question now is what you intend to do with these feelings you have for Ayanna." "Honestly, I don't know. I've never been in a situation like this before. I care about her enough to want to find a way to make it work, but I'm not sure how." Dakota was quiet for a long moment, looking out over the village where children were playing in the snow and women were preparing the evening meal. "My brother used to say that the strongest relationships are built on understanding and respect, not just on passion. He said that love without respect dies quickly, but respect without love is empty. Your brother was a wise man. Yes. He would have liked you, I think, and he would want Ayanna to have the chance for happiness, regardless of where it might be found. They walked back toward the village as the sun began to set. Jake felt as if he had passed some kind of test, but he wasn't sure what came next. That evening, the entire village gathered around a large fire for storytelling and music. Jake sat with Ayanna's family, listening to tales told in both English and the native language. When someone produced a guitar and began playing folk songs, Jake surprised everyone by joining in with a rich baritone voice. "You sing well," Ayanna said softly as the music continued around them. "My mother taught me," Jake replied. She said music was one of the things that connected all people, regardless of their differences. Your mother was wise, like your father. Actually, I never knew my father. My mother raised me alone after he died when I was very young. Ayanna looked at him with new understanding. So you know something about being different, about not quite fitting the usual patterns. I suppose I do. Maybe that's part of why I don't judge people by their appearances or backgrounds. As the evening progressed, Jake found himself more and more comfortable among Ayanna's relatives. Several of the men approached him with questions about cattle ranching, showing genuine interest in his work. The women included him in their conversations about practical matters like weather prediction and animal care, areas where his knowledge was relevant and appreciated. When the formal gathering broke up, Ayanna walked with Jake to the area where Thunder was tethered. The horse had been well cared for by the village children, who were fascinated by an animal so much larger than their own horses. "Your people have been very kind to me," Jake said. "More kind than I expected." "They see what I saw in you," Ayanna replied. "An honest man who judges people by their character rather than their appearance." "Ayanna, I need to tell you something. I've been thinking about what you said yesterday, about careful thought and time to clear the mind." "Yes? I don't need time to know how I feel about you. I've known that since our second day in the cave. What I need is to know whether you think we could find a way to make this work." Ayanna was quiet for a long moment, stroking Thunder's nose while she considered her response. "Jake, there would be challenges that you cannot imagine. Your people might never fully accept me, and some of my people would always view you with suspicion. We would be creating something new, a path that neither of our cultures has walked before. But is it possible? My uncle thinks it is. He told me that my father would want me to choose happiness over security, love over convention." Jake felt his heart skip a beat. "And what do you think?" Ayanna turned to face him, and in the moonlight, Jake could see tears glistening in her eyes. "I think that what we found together during that storm was more real than anything I have felt before. I think that walking away from it would be the greatest mistake of my life." "Then don't walk away," Jake said, stepping closer to her. "We'll figure out the rest as we go. It will not be easy. Nothing worth having ever is." Ayanna looked up at him, and Jake saw his own feelings reflected in her dark eyes. "My aunt has invited you to stay for the winter to learn our ways and let us learn yours. She thinks it would be good for both our peoples to have someone who can speak for understanding instead of fear. And you? What do you think?" "I think my aunt is very wise. I also think I'm not ready to say goodbye to Jake Morrison." Jake felt as if a weight had been lifted from his shoulders. "Then I'll stay if you'll have me. I can send word to the Broken Arrow that I'm safe and will return in the spring." "You would do that? Leave your life behind for someone you have known for only a few days?" "I'm not leaving my life behind," Jake said, reaching for her hands. "I'm starting a new one." They stood together in the moonlight, holding hands and looking into each other's eyes. Around them, the sounds of the village settling in for the night created a peaceful backdrop to their moment of decision. "There is one more thing," Ayanna said softly. "In our culture, when a man wishes to court a woman, he must first prove his worth through his actions, not just his words." What kind of actions? He must show that he can contribute to the welfare of her family and community. He must demonstrate respect for our ways while maintaining his own dignity. He must prove that his feelings are based on understanding, not just attraction. Jake smiled. Sounds like a reasonable test. How long do I have to prove myself? As long as it takes, Ayanna replied, returning his smile. But I should warn you, my relatives are very good judges of character. Then I guess I'd better start proving myself right away. As they walked back toward the village together, Jake felt a sense of rightness that he had never experienced before. The path ahead would be challenging, and there would be obstacles that neither of them could foresee, but they would face them together. The storm that had brought them together had indeed changed things that had remained the same too long, just as Ayanna's grandmother had predicted. It had taken a white cowboy from Texas and an Apache woman from the high desert and shown them that understanding between different peoples was not only possible, but could be the foundation for something beautiful and lasting. 3 months later, Jake Morrison was still living in Ayanna's village, learning the language and customs of her people while teaching them about cattle ranching and horse training. His letters to the Broken Arrow Ranch had resulted in a tentative agreement for the tribe to provide horses for the ranch in exchange for winter feed and veterinary care. More importantly, Jake and Ayanna had begun to build something together that honored both their backgrounds while creating something entirely new. Their courtship was watched with interest by both communities, and while not everyone approved, most people could see that their connection was based on genuine respect and understanding. On a warm spring day, as Jake sat with Ayanna watching children play by the creek where they had first stopped to water thunder, he reflected on how much his life had changed since that blizzard. "Any regrets?" Ayanna asked, as if reading his thoughts. "Only one," Jake replied. "What is that?" "I regret that it took a near-death experience for me to find you." Ayanna laughed, the sound that had become Jake's favorite music. Perhaps the spirits decided it was time for both of us to stop being alone. Perhaps they did, Jake agreed, taking her hand. And perhaps they knew what they were doing. As the sun set over the red rocks in the distance, Jake Morrison and Ayanna sat together planning their future. Two people from different worlds who had found common ground in understanding, respect, and love. The storm that had brought them together was long past, but the warmth they had discovered in each other's company continued to burn bright, promising to sustain them through whatever challenges lay ahead. Their story would be told around fires for generations to come, a testament to the idea that the strongest bonds are often formed not in comfort and ease, but in moments when people must rely on each other's strength and wisdom to survive. It was a story of two cultures learning to see past their differences, and of two hearts learning that love knows no boundaries when it is based on true understanding and mutual respect.